Hello again, Dr. Mark here, bringing you back to Dr. Mark Dissertation Mentoring Handbook and Book 1 Strategies for Quantitative Research, and we are calling straight from the Dissertation Mentoring Handbook studio. And remember, Dr. Mark Dissertation Mentoring Handbook gives you wings to fly far and high in your dissertation research. Book 1 is meant for doctoral learners working on quantitative dissertation projects. You are encouraged to read this handbook the earliest possible in your dissertation process, preferably before you start formulating your statement of the problem. And another point is that this book is supported by doctoral research seminars online. So today we are going to speak about the anatomy of chapter 2 of a quantitative proposal. This is in part 2 of the Dissertation Mentoring Handbook, Book 1. And in part 2 we discuss the anatomy of chapter 2 of a quantitative proposal. The focus of chapter 2 is literature review, as you know. The average length of chapter 2 is about 40 pages. The recommended length of chapter 2 is between 30 and 50 pages. And chapter 2 contains 3 sections. The first section is the introduction of the chapter. The second section contains an explanation about the processes of collecting literature from various sources. This is the process of documentation. It is in this section that you explain the strategy that you use to gather literature for your study. The third section of chapter 2 is the body of the chapter. You will learn that you always have 2 variables in every research project. In research, your goal is to discover how one variable influences or affects the other variable. Variables in experimental design of a quantitative research are dependent and independent variables. In non-experimental and quasi-experimental research, we use the terms predictor and outcome variable instead of the terms independent and dependent variables respectively. Okay, in the body of the chapter, you discuss your 2 variables in 3 perspectives: the historical perspective, the current findings, and the gap in literature. This is the triad of literature review. Again, the historical perspective, current findings, and the gap. Always remember to structure your literature review in that way, using that triad. Discuss the history of a variable, the current thinking about the variable, and the gap in literature about the variable for each variable. Consequently, the body of chapter 2 contains each one of the 2 variables in 3 dimensions, or explore each of the 2 variables in 3 dimensions. Hence you have 6 distinct subsections in the body of chapter 2. Finally, you write a conclusion and a summary of chapter 2. Okay, so how do you introduce chapter 2 of a proposal? An excellent strategy for starting chapter 2 of the proposal is to use the statement of purpose as the introduction of the chapter. That is kind of good and easy. Use the statement of purpose that you wanted to develop for chapter 1 as your introduction. But at this point, I suppose you have not developed a statement of purpose, so you're going to leave the introduction open. Okay, don't sweat it at this point. But as soon when you finish conducting the literature review about the variables and the instrument, you will straight away know how to write your statement of purpose. A restatement of purpose as the introduction of chapter 2 brings the reader back to the purpose of the study. The purpose reminds the reader of the method and design, the major variable in the study, geographic locations, and population parameters. Using the statement of purpose as the introduction of chapter 2 also helps you to frame the chapter. The framework of chapter 2 of the proposal emerges from the purpose. Simply put, the introduction of chapter 2 is a statement of purpose. Okay, so I'm not going to belabor that point. Remember that the purpose statement has got 7 elements. The first element is a statement of the method, E and the appropriateness of the method, the design, the appropriateness of the design, the population, the sample, the geographic location, and the instrument that you're going to use. So all those elements need to come to the purpose, but this point today we're not discussing about the purpose statement. We'll visit that when we come to speak about chapter 1. Today we are just talking about how to develop chapter 2. So one point I want to make here is that writing the introduction of chapter 2 has to wait until you have completed doing the review of literature about the variables. That means that the first place to begin when writing chapter 2 is the review of literature itself, so that when you finish reviewing the literature about the variables and the instrument, then you can come back and write the introduction. And it is only after you've done those things that you're only also able to write the second section of chapter 2, which is called documentation. So let's talk briefly about the variables in your study. So in this section, introduce the major variables in your study. You can only have 2 major variables in one study. You're testing how one of the variables affects or influences the other variable. A variable is a characteristic. When thinking about variables, remember that quantitative design fall into 3 broad categories. 1 is the experimental design, 2 is quasi-experimental design, and 3 is non-experimental design. Experimental studies follow experimental design and are suitable for finding cause-effect relationship between variables. The experimental designs involve the introduction of an intervention to and monitoring the effect of that intervention on the study participants. Experimental studies are prospective and they follow a cohort of study participants. Variables in experimental design are dependent and independent variables. The outcome measured in the experimental design is the dependent variable, while the intervention is the independent variable. Experimental research designs are expensive, time-consuming, and difficult to set up compared to non-experimental design. Non-experimental designs emerge to overcome the need for introducing interventions to find associations between and among variables. Non-experimental designs such as correlational techniques, multiple regression analysis, linear regressions, logistic regressions, multivariate analysis, and the like apply statistical modeling to find association between variables. Non-experimental designs are also synthetic designs because their results step from statistical manipulation of data rather than from direct observation and measurement of specific interventions. Although non-experimental design can help to find associations between or among variables, they do not help to find causal relationships. Because of this, we do not use the terms dependent and independent variable in non-experimental designs. Instead, we replace the term independent variable with various terms such as predictor variable, criterion variable, or attribute variable. For simplicity, let us use the term predictor variable in this book. Likewise, we do not use the term dependent variable in non-experimental design. In its place, we use the term outcome variable. Okay, begin the first sentence in the paragraph in the section about variables in the study by naming your dependent and independent variable in case of an experimental design, or predictor and outcome variable in case of a quasi-experimental or non-experimental design. For experimental studies, to discover the effect of leadership training and advancement among women, the first 2 sentences should read as follows. Advancement of women to leadership positions is a dependent variable in the study. Leadership training is the independent variable. See, when you write that sentence, those two sentences that way, the reader is able to know straight away what you're doing. And when you mention the term dependent variable and independent variable, they suggest an experiment. For non-experimental study designed to discover the association or relationship between leadership training and advancement of women to leadership positions, the first two sentences should read: advancement of women to leadership position is the outcome variable in the study. Leadership training is the predictive variable. Note, in this case, because the study is non-experimental, we use the term outcome variable instead of dependent variable, and predictor variable instead of independent variable. So from here, you can explain to the reader that this literature review contains an exploration of the two variables from three perspectives: the history of each variable, the current reality of each variable, and the gap in literature about each variable. The question that comes to mind is how to determine the cut-off dates for deciding what is history and what is current. I recommend using 5-year limit as the cut-off point for what is history, because this is also what is recommended by the School of Advanced Study and the Office of the Dean. So 5-year cut-off limit is your dividing line between what is history and what is current. I suggest that you classify all literature written 5 years and earlier as history. Classify all literature written in the last 5 years as current. This rule works in many situations. However, in some situations, events are very slow to evolve, and there may be no literature in the last 5 years. Such cases are rare and exceptional. It is unlikely that you fail to find recent, that is less than 5 years old, literature about any topic in the information age. After presenting this information, write a transition paragraph explaining that you'll be tackling the next subject in the next chapter. Thank you so much for listening. Again, this comes to you directly from Dr. Mark Dissertation Mentoring Hardbook Studios. Today we are talking about strategies for quantitative research. We have just explored briefly about how to start writing chapter 2. Thank you.